Good morning. My name is Cara McGlynn, and I am the lead school social worker for Northeast Metro 916. This morning, I will be co-facilitating with the amazing Shania Walker. Shania, would you mind go ahead and giving an introduction?
Good morning. I am Shania Walker. I am the restorative practice lead for 916.
Perfect. So today we are going to be talking to you all about building authentic relationships through the lens of historic trauma and restorative practices. Before we get started, I would like all of you to go to your Pear Deck link and make sure that you're open and following along. There will be interactive portions of this presentation. There will also be opportunities in which we will invite you to pause. This is actually one of those opportunities. So if you could please seat yourself in a position where your feet are about hip width apart, touching the ground, and your back is gently cradled into the chair, you can go ahead and pause here and follow the directions around taking a moment of quiet, trying to let your stress go, taking a deep breath in through your nose, exhaling through your mouth, and thinking to yourself, I am here, I am ready. Go ahead and pause for about a minute to practice this breathing technique. For those that are finished or who chose not to engage, we're going to go ahead and move forward. Okay, so why do we as 916 talk so much about trauma? Before we get into the context of historical trauma, which is collective, I want us to be thinking more about your prior education on individual or contextual trauma. As school systems, we do a phenomenal job identifying single incidents of trauma, naming them, treating them, and supporting them. We know that people experience them in the workplace, in their home environment, and in the community. And by them, I mean traumas. And these are just some numbers to be thinking about. Trauma, I like to tell our students, is when it builds up in your body, and it's too much for too long. When your own experiences and abilities to navigate or cope with situations are overwhelmed. What happens is our system has an actual trauma response, which happens neurobiologically and physiologically. We have chemicals in our body that are released, and our brain does actually begin to change over time if we have extended amounts of trauma. At this point, all of our staff have had our introductory trauma trainings, so I know you already have a foundation for this. The piece I want to highlight here, though, is this volcano image. And this is an image a lot of our school social workers at Cora do use when we talk about trauma with our scholars, because this is a subjective experience. When you have a lot of trauma, you are walking around with all of these emotions, and it's percolating in you throughout the day until something happens that triggers you and you explode. And the persons you explode on, you don't have any trajectory for those feelings, right? So it hits everyone around you, much like a volcano. That explosion, though, also can be shut down and withdraw. So there are over-escalated, and then there's like this under or a hypoarousal that can happen. So hyperarousal is going to be those big behaviors. The hypo is going to be that shutdown withdrawal. Both of those are linked to trauma. And again, when we think about contextual trauma, as a group, we are able to come together and say, wow, I know that Cara just experienced the loss of her father. So that is why we are seeing these behaviors, and we are able to then support appropriately. And it's a lot harder when we start thinking about this volcano experience that's happening to us, but we can't see the event, right? So when we think about trauma, we're formulating it using SAMHSA's model of event, experience, and effect. And again, right now we're staying in contextual trauma, so individualistic trauma. When a person has an event that occurs, and it can be an event that multiple people are exposed to. Their individual experience is what makes that event have the effect of trauma. So, Shania, how do you feel about dogs?
I am currently learning to like dogs.
Okay.
It's a new thing for me. I wasn't sure, but my son he's bent on getting a puppy. So that's what I'm working on, trying to wrap myself around that part.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to use the both of us for an example on this. So if Shania and I are going for a walk, so that's our event, right? And we go past a house that has really big barking dogs. Shania, how are you going to react to those big barking dogs jumping at the fence at us?
So because this is all new to me, I would probably freak out a little bit because big dogs are a thing. So probably a little bit afraid. My response would be fear.
Thank you. Thank you for being so vulnerable and transparent too. For me, I have really big dogs and I love really big dogs. So I am walking past this fence with Shania. Shania is having some fear for her safety. And maybe even for her life if they're really big dogs. And I am thinking, oh, puppies, right? And so like we walk away from that event. We had a different subjective experience, so individually, but then the experience following the event too, as far as who we interact with, is going to go vastly different, just for the purpose of this example. So for the purpose of this example, following that event, I have supportive systems around me and I am able to explain my day to them. We all laugh about how great those big dogs were. The effect is I am able to move on. For Shania, and again, just for the purposes of this example, she was afraid of the dogs, potentially felt that it was life-threatening in some way. Her experience was that potentially people made fun of her for that. So she shared the story with people that she cared about, and maybe she was invalidated. Oh, why are you so weird about dogs? They're just dogs. Maybe she had persons around her who had had traumatic experiences with dogs too. So they shared those traumas with her, but they didn't help her navigate them. So, oh, well, Shania, yeah, did you know that I was bit in the face when I was even younger than you? And I still to this day think dogs are out to get me. So in that experience, Shania is not getting support to mitigate her scared feelings. If anything, the experience is adding to the fact that she feels like she can't navigate that situation. So potentially in this example, the effect would be Shania maybe starts having nightmares or intrusive thoughts, or every time she sees a dog, she starts crying or shaking uncontrollably. Shania, in this example, ends up with a trauma. When we are thinking about single incidents or contextual traumas, we understand that because of the research available to us, it is this culmination of critical incidents that, if are not interrupted, lead to a negative outcome of early death. Because again, it culminates. So we have those adverse childhood experiences, those early traumas, which disrupt neurodevelopment, which impact and impair our social, emotional, cognitive development, which then puts us at risk for health behaviors, right? So we start doing risk taking. Maybe we engage in unhealthy coping mechanisms, and that is a health risk behavior. Which then leads to disease, disability, and social problems, which then leads to potentially early death. At any point, these cycles can be interrupted. And it is so important to name that because one of the best tools we have for interruption at 916 is our restorative practices. And we will get to that. When we are thinking about where our students are right now in our current cultural context, we need to remember that in hierarchical needs, we are on the most basic tier of support. We have students that are struggling with access to basic essentials. So until we are able to support them as a society with like access to food and shelter, we are not able then to develop that safety and security need. However, if we are having really meaningful, intentional community-based interventions and we are able to get them those physiological needs, then we as school staff can intervene on that safety and security. When we have students who have the impact of unmet needs, we see it show up in various ways. And I just invite you to take a moment to pause if you'd like to read through this. And here we're going to go ahead and pause in your Pear Deck and reflect. So pause this presentation, go to your Pear Deck slides, and if you could please type in your reflection. For your reflections, Shanae and I will be looking at these after this presentation, and we will be reaching out to folks and responding as needed. So when you finish typing in your reflection, unpause and go ahead and continue the video. As we are thinking about returning to school under our current cultural context of a pandemic and of racial violence and unrest that really has been perpetuated for the past 400 years and is currently being brought to light, here are 2 additional questions that we're curious to know what you think. What do you feel as a staff you're already equipped with? What do you already know? And as a staff, what do you feel like you need to know? Again, please pause here and go into your Pear Deck, respond to these prompts, and we will be using this to inform our additional trainings throughout the year. Okay. So again, I was talking a lot about single incident trauma. And when I say single incident, I don't necessarily mean one trauma happened to that person. I mean, it's individual in context. I want now to shift to be thinking about collective traumas, or what we also call historic and intergenerational trauma, and how they impact various communities which are typically oppressed. Before we get there, I want to remind you all of the SAMHSA model key principles. As 916, we have adopted these key principles to support our practice. We are saying that we are connecting to each of these in order to recognize, intervene on, support, and avoid re-traumatizing all of our learners and our staff, especially that avoiding re-traumatizing. We don't want that happening in our systems. So go ahead and take a moment here and read through them. When we are thinking specifically about COVID-19 in relationship to the key principles, Shanae and I went through this and we wanted to kind of bridge them. So as you're looking at the first key principle of safety, we want that to connect to what our sites are doing to support families and scholars' understanding around COVID-19, right? And we also want to be really transparent as far as naming safety concerns. That goes to trustworthiness and transparency. Again, I invite you to take a moment just to read through the list and the connection to the SAMHSA key principles. There's also an opportunity here for you to pause, and in Pear Deck, if you have other thoughts that we're missing that link to the key principles that would be good practice techniques, please do pause and add in your responses. Similarly, when we think about racial trauma in our current cultural conversation, Shanae and I sought to align the SAMHSA key principles with some basic practice techniques that connect across. So when we are thinking about trustworthiness and transparency, it is imperative that we name that we are really talking about 400 years of racial violence and oppression. It is imperative that when we think about peer support, we lean into our own discomfort. Again, this is an invitation for you to pause and read through how these align with the key principles as far as the practice techniques on the left. and also an invitation to go into Pear Deck because we are really interested in you sharing your collective wisdom with us. So by all means, please go in and write any additional thoughts you have connected to the key model principles as far as practice techniques that would be supportive to supporting our scholars and families as we are navigating racial trauma in our communities. In order for us to truly support change, we have to start with a basis of our own education. When we think about collective traumas, especially if you are in a white body, it is imperative that you begin with your own development of a racial consciousness and raising your critical awareness and how you interact across difference so that you are able to do so in a nonviolent way. And that starts with, in trauma practice, learning about collective traumas. So in that, we have our intergenerational traumas. Intergenerational trauma began in research around 1966 when Canada started looking at how the children of Holocaust survivors had trauma responses, even though they themselves were not the persons that experienced the primary trauma. So this is when we start talking about that non-contextual trauma. Maybe this incident or event did not necessarily happen in my lifetime, but that event and that experience have the same effect of trauma. From that research, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is also a clinical social worker, realized that the cumulative emotional and mental wounding that happens over lifespans that was described in that initial research really fit with what was happening on reservations with the Native and Indigenous people. She expanded that research to look at what we call disenfranchised grief and internalized oppression. Because of the trauma, people internalize the view of the oppressor, and it has been found that some persons perpetuate in that cycle of self-hatred. Now, just like I was saying a moment ago, it is imperative that we raise a racial consciousness. It is also imperative that in our work, we actively strive to be anti-racist. And in order to do that, we need to be aware that this research exists and it is not applicable to every single Black, Indigenous person of color. Not every single Black, Indigenous person of color would say that they have a trauma experience because of historic and intergenerational trauma. However, collectively, there is research that indicates for some folks, this is their experience. So just be sure that in learning these concepts, you are not perpetuating a racist agenda by assuming things about folks. Learn things, get to know your kids. When we think about trauma in the Latinx and Hispanic community, research has broken it down into 3 phases. Again, I invite you to pause here and read. When we think about trauma in the LGBTQ plus community, again, research indicates that folks that are anything other than heterosexual white men typically have a higher rate of trauma. That is not to say that heterosexual white men do not experience trauma, but when we are thinking about non-contextual and collective trauma, we are thinking about typically oppressed groups, folks that are traditionally marginalized. Again, I invite you to pause and read through this information. Okay, so we know when we are working with folks in trauma, there are a lot of things that don't work. And it's important for us to name those because it's very easy for us to slip into these behaviors. And it's also important for us to recognize when our peers are slipping into these behaviors so that we can consciously and caringly support our peers in calling out those behaviors. Because again, as a system, we are working to actively avoid re-traumatization. Anytime we engage in these behaviors, we run the risk of re-traumatizing kids. Again, I've alluded to 916's vision for trauma-aware care, and here is just more explicit connotation around that, and what it actually looks like in our system. So I invite you to pause and read through this, and when you're ready, go ahead and hit play. And then as we are starting to bridge, again, restorative practices is a vehicle for resolving trauma. It is an intervention that we are able to develop safe, supportive, meaningful relationships. And I will leave Shania to say much more about that. But as we're bridging and connecting and aligning these two practices, I invite you one last time for the trauma portion to pause, enter into Pear Deck, and answer these few questions. And when you're done with that, go ahead and give yourself a minute or two to stretch. And when you are ready, go ahead and hit play. And with that, I pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Shania Walker.
Okay, well, welcome back. And I just want to give just kind of this bridge from the trauma to the restorative practices. One does not work without the other. As we saw from some of the slides and some of the things that Kara was speaking to, discipline does not work when we're dealing with scholars, students who have experienced these types of traumas. And the realness to that is so many of the students that we have here have experienced some form of trauma. So as we're looking at what restorative justice is, it's really the approach to discipline that focuses on repairing the relationships. We call our learning communities because that is in fact what they are. And so if we're looking at restorative justice from that lens, knowing that it's really about engaging with the people who are involved. So everybody who's a part of those community needs to feel invested in that. And so that's what restorative justice looks at. If we're talking kind of some of the historical context, restorative justice really began surfacing kind of in the 70s as a mediation, kind of a conciliation between victims and offenders, but it really was in a community model because we know in our communities, if we are struggling with our neighbors, our whole community struggles. You pick a side, this is what's happening, and that's also here present in our school communities. Kara, you want to go to the next slide, please? Okay. So initially, if we're looking at tribal court justice versus American justice, really American justice is based on rules and principles, where with the tribal court justice, indigenous justice is based on the relationships and the webs of connectivity. So it's really important in the tribal court model to look at what are the relationships, who's impacted by this, how do we move forward from this, because we are in fact a community and that is what's important. So that's the big distinction between the two. Okay, so to honor our Indigenous peacemaking circles, this is where this all came from. And so if we're looking at repairing harm and restoring our community, it's about the Native belief that in the tribal courts, we're fixing what has happened. And it's about restoring, and it's harmonizing, and it's restoring the balance for everybody who was affected. That's why when we're doing our restorative processes, we talk about who was impacted by this. How are they affected? Who do you need to fix it with? Those are all things that matter because, in fact, people are affected on different levels in the community as a whole, not just the two people or the parties that were directly involved. And so the primary goal is to reintegrate and fix it within the community after something has happened. Okay, so restorative practices, I think the easy way to kind of say that is restorative justice is the model and restorative practices is the work that we do. And again, it's focusing on building our healthy communities, on increasing social capita, decreasing crime and antisocial behavior, and repairing harm and restoring the relationships, because that is ultimately what our goal is in the school, in the community, in all the places, that this is what is happening when we're doing restorative practices. Here in our school setting. So about 3 years ago, we as a district decided that we were going to use the restorative practices model in an effort to decrease our suspension rates and to really improve our engagement and our relationships, not just with families, but with staff and with students. And so ultimately, it is kind of intended in the school setting to get the small groups to talk and talk about their grievances and figure out how we fix it. To do it on their own at some point, but as we're kind of building capacity for this, it's really us as a community working together to say, how do we fix this? And they get to take ownership in that. And we get to have scholars get a voice. Sometimes they would normally not have that. So I like to call kind of the work that we do here in the school, it's really kind of the great equalizer. We have bigger personalities who are really more vocal, and then we have the people that are not as vocal, that are experiencing some of the trauma and don't usually get to speak about the harm that's been done to them. And so when we do restorative work, it is the opportunity to kind of balance it out for everybody, and everybody's voice is heard and everybody's voice is equally important. So that's kind of how I like to describe that in our school setting. Some of the work that we do currently, especially here at Cora and also in some other places around the district, are our restorative chats and check-ins. And what that looks like is when there's a situation that happens, it may not be a high magnitude thing that happens, but something that was disruptive to the learning environment. We have a follow-up conversation with the scholar about that. And then we'll do check-ins regarding the situation to figure out, do we need to do something else? Is there another restorative intervention that we need to put in place here so that we can figure out what the issue is and how we repair that relationship so that we can move forward and have it be a functioning part or component of our community. With the restorative worksheets, that is just a tool that we use here. And it's been really, really great to see scholars process through these worksheets. A lot of times in the moment, they're not thinking about maybe what triggered it or who else was impacted by whatever the situation was. And so with the restorative worksheet, it really is like that first kind of processing tool to just kind of say, okay, what happened? How do I fix this? How do we move on? How do we make this better? And so that is one of the things that, especially when you're back in person, you'll get to see those, but those are available online also. With the individual restorative plans, we will, as a team, come together and figure out, maybe it's an ongoing thing. Maybe it is a issue between two scholars. Maybe it's some internet and community things that are happening. And we figure out, how do we support and provide restorative interventions in the situation to help to repair it and move past it. And so some of those things may include, we have had these ongoing conversations where we build up scholars to have face-to-face conversations with each other. Not necessarily a circle, not necessarily anything on a formal level, but just so that we prep them and prepare them to have a conversation and express what they need and express how they're feeling and how they can be supported and move forward. With the restorative circles, we do staff circles, we do SEL circles, community building circles, and circles to repair harm. It will look differently now that we are in distance learning for the beginning of the school year, but they have been really effective. We did them in the spring when we first started with the distance learning piece, and then they were done during the ESY timeframe. And so they work. They're not called circles when they are virtual. They are called community spaces, but they still work. The kids that have kind of got the foundation of what the circles would look like are easily able to move into the community spaces. And even for those who hadn't experienced the traditional circle before, they've been able to transition into the community spaces to do some of this work. So those are going to continue to happen, and those are really a key piece of community building, especially as we're in this distant learning model. The reentry circles following suspension or arrest, anytime there is a significant situation where we have either had to suspend a scholar or they have been taken into custody, we make it a point, and it doesn't always get to happen because of other circumstances, but we make it a full effort to try to do a reentry meeting that is in a circle type format, because it's really important that once something that big happens, we want to make sure that we're addressing that and that people have a voice and are able to say how they were impacted, how they feel about it, because we also need to figure out how to support that scholar so that they're able to be successful when they do return back to the community. Okay, so our in-person circle expectations. The first one, of course, is going to be confidentiality. What we say in the circle stays in the circle. We're not talking about it with other people. We're not bringing other people into it. We are just kind of leaving it in that space. And that's one of the real core pieces to that. We have to know that what we talk about in those circles is safe. Of course, if there's talk of harm or threat to another person, then we do have to let people know that. But we say that to the students as well as we get ready to go into the circle. The second one is listening to understand. And you can disagree with a person, but not shutting down your brain and being open to learn something new. And so we say this right away as we're kind of getting into that space. We respect the talking piece. The talking piece is critical. You know that when you have that, then everybody, all eyes are on you, and it's your turn to say your piece. And then number 4 is going to be you can pass. If you don't have anything that you want to say, or you need an opportunity to think about it and ask them to come back, you can pass, because there's always going to be an opportunity to say it when we come back to you. And then we always offer up an opportunity for the people that are participating in our circle to say what they need. I've had situations where scholars have said, I can't hear the cussing, or things like that have happened. And so this is really a space so that they can take ownership and make this space their own also. So sometimes we will get different requests, and some of them aren't always appropriate as far as adding, but we do offer that opportunity so that they can feel ownership in this space as well. So our community spaces. That is the name that restorative facilitators in the community around have been using. All of the trainings that I've participated in this summer that have been via Zoom or Google Meets, that is what we're calling them, because they are in fact not a circle. And so to honor that they are separate, because it is in fact virtual, we do call it community spaces, because it is still a place for us to come together as a community and join and build together and work on our relationships. So we do call them community spaces. One of the first norm is going to be consistent with in person. It's going to be confidentiality. Sorry about that. And again, we're going to keep what is in the circle. Listening to understand, that's still going to be important. And also what I do ask when we're in a community space is that if you are not talking, we ask the people to mute their mic. Because there's all of these loud distractions when those aren't mute. And that's just a reminding the participants to be present. And so that's been really helpful to say that piece during that time. The next one is going to be respecting the order chosen for the conversation. Usually in the virtual spaces, the co-facilitator is going to put in the comment section the order in which you go in. And so making sure that you identify that and that the participants are aware of that, and then we move through that order and respect that order. It's just like what the talking piece, but it's our virtual talking piece. The fourth one is you can always pass again. And then in an effort to kind of keep our community space flowing, we do ask that you say pass when you are done talking, even in this virtual space, so that the next person in the order knows that it's their turn to go. And then the last one is, again, we will still add expectations that you need in order for this to be successful. With some of the virtual community spaces that we did over the summer, some of the kids had music playing, or they had TV loud, or those kind of things. And so some of the kids would say, could you turn your TV down? And that is also them working together to tell each other, hey, I just need this from you so that we can have this good conversation. And after practice, they were able to do that really well with each other. So that's just a really good one, especially now in this new kind of virtual space. Okay, so here is a nice little place where we're going to do a self-reflection. I want you to go into Pear Deck and in there respond to these questions that we've got here. What is your experience with restorative practice? What excites you about restorative practices? What reservations or questions do you have about restorative practices? And what supports are you going to need in order to be able to implement trauma-aware practices and using the restorative lens? So just take a couple minutes here to write your responses in Pear Deck, and then we will come back and move on. Okay, take care of yourself. So right now, most of us are experiencing a whole bunch of stress and pressure based on COVID, school, all the things. So this is a huge one. And so just kind of looking at this, you want to speak up. You want to spread the responsibility. You want to set up a regular check-in with somebody. I have accountability buddies all over the district, like, hey, can we check in? You want to say yes when someone offers assistance. I struggle with that. I like to just kind of go and do things. Kara struggles with that. She likes to kind of just go and do things. But being able to accept assistance when it's offered to you, because right now in these times especially, it's so very necessary. And be willing to relinquish some control. Another thing that many of us struggle with, but super important if we're talking self-care. And that's what we're talking about at this moment. Go ahead, Kara.
Yeah, and if you'll just take a moment to pause here and put in an intention for yourself. So what neuroscience has taught us is that when we set intentions, not only are we more likely to follow through with an activity, but we're also setting the cognitive framework in order to make that intention a reality. So we are asking that you pause in Pear Deck here and share with us one intention that you are willing to make related to taking care of yourself this school year. And because you're writing it down, we get to follow up with it. So please take a moment, and when you're ready, go ahead and proceed. So as we're coming to our end, Shanae and I just wanted to Ross Green you. He's a researcher. But Ross Green has this big thing that, kids do well if they can. And that is absolutely the heart of restorative practices and trauma-aware practices and our district equity work. And also a big piece to that is that adults are caring and compassionate when we take care of ourselves. We really appreciate you spending some time with us this morning. Here is our information if you would like to hit us up with any questions. Thank you. Shania, anything else?
Thank you. And this year's going to be different, and we are going to have some challenges, but I think being able to take care of ourselves and take care of each other is what's going to get us through it.